The clipboard trembled in Margaret's hands as three strangers in crisp polo shirts marched toward her barn, clipboards raised like weapons. "Ma'am, we're here for the mandatory HOA inspection," the lead man announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But Margaret knew the truth. There was no HOA on her 40-acre ranch. These weren't inspectors. They were something far worse. And when Thunder, her prize stallion, caught their scent and began pawing the ground with murderous intent, Margaret realized she was about to witness something that would change everything. Because sometimes the real monsters wear polo shirts and carry fake badges. And sometimes Margaret Holloway was mucking out Thunder's stall when she first heard the car doors slam. 3 sharp reports echoed across her property like gunshots, cutting through the peaceful morning air of her Texas ranch. She paused, pitchfork in hand, and listened. Voices, male voices, confident, authoritative voices that didn't belong on her land. 53 years old and built like a fence post doll, lean muscle and weathered. Determination. Margaret had lived on this 40-acre spread for 12 years. She knew every sound that belonged here, the whistle of wind through mesquite trees, the distant lowing of cattle from the neighboring ranch, the soft nickering of her 6 horses as they grazed in the morning sun. These voices weren't part of her world's symphony. Thunder, her black stallion, lifted his massive head and flared his nostrils. His ears swiveled toward the sound like radar dishes, and Margaret felt the familiar tingle of unease that came when her horses sensed something wrong. In her experience, horses were better judges of character than most people. "Easy, boy," she murmured, running her hand along Thunder's neck. His muscles were tense, coiled like springs ready to release. "Let's see what we're dealing with?" Margaret stepped out of the barn and shaded her eyes against the bright September sun. 3 men in matching navy polo shirts and khaki pants were walking up her gravel drive, clipboards in hand. They moved with the practiced swagger of people accustomed to authority, their eyes scanning her property with the clinical detachment of assessors. The lead man was tall and thin, with prematurely gray hair, slicked back, and small dark eyes that reminded Margaret of a weasel. His companions flanked him like bodyguards. One was built like a linebacker, all shoulders and intimidation, while the other was younger, nervous, constantly adjusting his glasses. Mrs. Holloway, the gray-haired man's voice, carried across the yard with practiced authority. "I'm Robert Henley with the Clearwater Estates Homeowners Association. We're here for your mandatory property inspection, to Icewater." She'd heard those words before 13 years ago when developers had tried to force her off her family's land in Colorado. The same cold smile, the same false authority, the same predatory gleam in their eyes. "There's no HOA on this property," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "This is unincorporated land, has been for over a century." Henley's smile widened, but it never touched his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been some confusion. The Clearwater Estates development was recently expanded to include your property. We have the paperwork right here." He held up a manila folder, waving it like a flag of conquest. Margaret had seen enough fraudulent documents in her lifetime to recognize the performance. The folder was too thin, too new, too conveniently prepared. "I'd like to see your identification," she said, not moving from her position by the barn. "And I'd like to know who gave you permission to enter my property." The linebacker stepped forward, his hand moving to something clipped to his belt. "Ma'am, we don't need permission for official HOA business. Now, if you'll cooperate with the inspection, this will go much smoother for everyone." Margaret's eyes flicked to his belt and saw the outline of a taser, not standard equipment for HOA inspectors, where she kept her phone, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would only make things worse. "What exactly are you inspecting?" she asked. "Property compliance," Henley said, consulting his clipboard with theatrical importance. "We've received complaints about livestock on residential property, unpermitted structures, and general code violations. We need to document everything for the board." "Complaints from who?" "My nearest neighbor is 2 miles away. Anonymous complaints," the younger man said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The board takes all concerns seriously." Margaret studied their faces, memorizing every detail. The linebacker's polo shirt was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. The younger man's clipboard was empty, except for a single sheet of paper that looked like it had been printed 5 minutes ago, and Henley's official folder had a coffee stain on the corner. These weren't HOA inspectors. They were something much worse. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd faced down bigger threats than 3 men in polo shirts. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is private property, and you're trespassing." For just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mrs. Holloway, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. The board has the authority to impose fines, place liens on your property, and even recommend foreclosure for noncompliance." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Margaret felt the familiar burn of rage in her chest, same fury that had driven her to fight developers, corrupt officials, and anyone else who'd tried to steal what was hers. "Over my dead body," she said quietly. The linebacker's hand moved to his taser. "Ma'am, I'd strongly advise you to reconsider your attitude. We're just here to do our job, your job." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your job is to scare an old woman into signing over her property. Your job is to flash fake badges and make empty threats. Your job is to be thieves in polo shirts." "That's enough," Henley snapped, his composure finally cracking. "You're interfering with official business, whether you cooperate or not." He gestured to his companions, and they started walking toward the barn. Margaret stepped sideways, blocking their path, but she knew she couldn't stop 3 men by herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she calculated her options. That's when thunder decided to join the conversation. Winnie cut through the morning air like a blade. It was followed by the thunderous sound of hooves against wood as he kicked his stall door once, twice, 3 times. The barn shook with the force of his fury. All 3 men froze. Even the linebacker looked nervous as the sound echoed across the property. "What the hell was that?" the younger man whispered. Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "That's Thunder. He doesn't like strangers on his property." As if summoned by his name, the stallion appeared at the barn door. 17. Hands of pure muscle and attitude. Thunder was a magnificent creature in his prime. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and his eyes held an intelligence that had always unsettled people who didn't know horses. Right now, those eyes were focused on the 3 intruders with laser-like intensity. "Jesus," the linebacker muttered, taking a step back. "That thing's huge." "He's not a thing," Margaret said, her voice hard as granite. "He's family, very protective of his home." Thunder stepped out of the barn, his massive hooves making no sound on the packed earth. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to explode into action. Could see his decision forming in those dark, intelligent eyes. He'd identified the threat. Now he was deciding what to do about it. "Mrs. Holloway," Henley said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, "you need to control that animal. If it attacks, we'll have to defend ourselves. Control him." Margaret laughed, stepping aside to give Thunder a clear path to the men. "Mister, I don't control Thunder. I respect him. There's a difference." The stallion began to move forward, his gait deceptively calm. But Margaret had seen this before, the predatory grace of a horse who'd made up his mind about something. Thunder wasn't just protecting his territory, he was making a statement. Back to the car, the linebacker said, his hand now openly gripping his taser. "We'll call this in." "Call what in?" Margaret asked. "Private property. The fact that you're carrying weapons while impersonating officials. The fact that you're trying to commit fraud." Henley's face flushed red. "We have every right to be here. This property falls under HOA jurisdiction, and we're conducting a legitimate inspection." "Prove it," Margaret said. "Show me the legal documents. Show me the survey that proves this land is part of your development. Show me anything that gives you the right to be here." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Thunder continued his slow advance, and Margaret could see the men's confidence cracking with each step the stallion took. "We don't have to prove anything to you," the younger man said, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. "We have our orders." "Orders from who?" Margaret pressed. "What's your supervisor's name? What's the phone number for your office? What's the name of the development company?" More silence. Thunder was now close enough that they could hear his breathing deep. 3 hours later, Margaret was in her kitchen, researching property fraud lawyers, when she heard the familiar crunch of gravel under tires. This time, however, the sound was different, heavier, more deliberate. She looked out her window and felt her stomach drop. Son of a bitch, Margaret muttered, watching as uniformed officers emerged from the cruiser. Sheriff Tom Bradley himself stepped out, his weathered face grim beneath his campaign hat. Margaret had known Tom for 8 years, ever since she'd moved to the county. He was a decent man, caught in an impossible situation. Behind him came the 3 fake inspectors, now flanked by 2 men in dark suits, who moved with the practiced efficiency of federal agents. Margaret's blood ran cold as she recognized the type she'd dealt with their kind before, in another life, in another state. Thunder was in the far pasture with the other horses, but even at this distance, Margaret could see his head come up as he caught the scent of strangers. The stallion began moving toward the house, his gait purposeful and alert. Margaret grabbed her phone and quickly dialed her attorney's number. "Sarah, it's Margaret. I need you to call me immediately. The situation we discussed has escalated. I'm about to be arrested on trumped-up charges, and I need you to know that everything I told you about Colorado is about to become relevant again. Call me." She hung up and walked to her front door, squaring her shoulders. Through the screen, she could see the small army assembling in her yard. Sheriff Bradley was talking quietly with one of the federal agents, their body language tense and uncomfortable. Could see he was performing for the officers, playing the role of the traumatized victim. She stepped onto her porch, her hands visible and empty. "Morning, Tom." Sheriff Bradley looked up, his expression pained. "Margaret, I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to need you to come with me." "On what charges?" "Assault with a deadly weapon, threatening public officials, and interfering with a lawful inspection." Margaret almost laughed. "A deadly weapon. Tom, you know my horses. You've been to every barbecue I've thrown for the past 8 years. Has Thunder ever been anything but gentle?" "That's not what these gentlemen are saying." Bradley gestured toward the fake inspectors. "They're claiming your horse attacked them while they were conducting official business." "Official business?" Margaret's voice rose. "Tom, these men are fraudsters. They're impersonating HOA officials, carrying weapons, and trying to commit property fraud." "Did you verify their credentials?" One of the federal agents stepped forward. He was younger than his partner, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed military background. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI. Been tracking these gentlemen for several weeks as part of an ongoing investigation into property fraud schemes." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "Then you know they're criminals. Your horse injured Mr. Henley's associate." Margaret looked at the linebacker, who was now sporting a dramatic limp and had his arm in a sling. "Thunder never touched him. He fell down running away." "That's not what the medical report says," the second agent said, stepping forward. He was older, with gray hair and cold eyes that reminded Margaret of a shark. "Agent Davis, FBI, Mr. Kowalski. Here has a dislocated shoulder and severe bruising consistent with being struck by a large animal." "Convenient," Margaret said dryly. "And I suppose you have witnesses to this alleged attack." "We have 3 sworn statements," Davis replied, holding up a folder. "And we have video evidence." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Video evidence." Henley stepped forward, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I recorded the entire incident on my phone. Your animal charged at us, unprovoked. We have everything we need to prove you're running a dangerous operation here. I'd like to see this." "Video," Margaret said. "Right now, we need to secure the scene and remove the dangerous animal. Remove Thunder." Margaret's voice was deadly quiet. "Over my dead body, Margaret," Sheriff Bradley said gently. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We just need to take him into custody until this gets sorted out." "You're not taking my horse anywhere, ma'am," Agent Martinez said. "The animal is considered evidence in a federal investigation. We have a warrant." He produced a folded paper from his jacket. Margaret snatched it and read quickly, her heart sinking with each line. It was legitimate, a federal warrant authorizing the seizure of 1 black stallion, approximately 17 hands high, involved in an assault on federal contractors. Federal contractors? Margaret looked up from the warrant. "These men told me they were HOA inspectors. They're working under contract with the Department of Housing and Urban Development," Agent Davis explained. "Rural property compliance is part of their mandate." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. Everything was falling into place with terrifying precision. The fake credentials, the federal backup, the convenient video evidence with serious resources was orchestrating this entire operation. "I want to call my lawyer," she said. "You can call from the station," Sheriff Bradley said. "Right now, I need you to come with me peacefully." Margaret looked across her property, where Thunder was now standing at the fence, watching the proceedings with obvious agitation. The other horses had joined Whiskey, her mare, and someone was trying to take them away from her. "Tom," she said quietly, "you've known me for 8 years. Have I ever lied to you?" "No, ma'am." "Have I ever been anything but a good neighbor and a law-abiding citizen?" "No, ma'am." "Then why are you believing these strangers over me?" Bradley's face was pained. "Your hands are tied, or your campaign fund is tied." The sheriff's face flushed red. "That's out of line." "Is it?" Margaret's voice was sharp as a blade. "Who's backing your re-election campaign, Tom? Who's donating to your war chest?" "Because I'm betting it's the same people who sent these clowns to my property." Agent Davis stepped forward. "Mrs. Holloway, you're in enough trouble without adding conspiracy theories to the mix. Now you can come with us voluntarily, or we can arrest you here in front of your neighbors." Margaret looked around and realized that several of her distant neighbors had gathered at the edge of her property. Drawn by the commotion, Mrs. Chen from the organic farm 2 miles east was standing by her pickup truck, her phone out, recording everything. "That's your right," Agent Martinez said, "but the animal still needs to be secured. How do you plan to secure a 17-hand stallion who doesn't trust strangers?" "We've brought a specialist," Agent Davis said, gesturing toward the black SUV. As if on cue, the SUV's rear door opened, and a woman in her 40s stepped out. She was dressed in jeans and a work shirt, with the kind of practical boots that suggested she actually worked with horses. She carried a coiled rope and a tranquilizer gun. "Dr. Sarah Chen," the woman said, approaching Margaret. "I'm a veterinarian, an equine specialist. I'm here to ensure your horse is handled safely during the transport." "Transport to where?" "There's a federal holding facility about an hour north of here. Your horse will be well cared for until this matter is resolved." Margaret studied the woman's face, looking for any sign of deception. Dr. Chen's expression was professional but not unkind, and her equipment looked genuine. But Margaret had learned not to trust appearances. "I want to be present during any handling of my horse," she said. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Agent Davis said. "Or for the people who are trying to steal my land." His pace was measured but determined, and Margaret could see the intelligence in his eyes as he assessed the situation. Dr. Chen, Agent Davis said, "You need to sedate that animal before it becomes a problem." "I'd prefer not to," Dr. Chen replied, studying Thunder's approach. "Tranquilizing a horse this size in an agitated state can be dangerous. If possible, I'd like to try a gentler approach." "There's no time for gentle," Agent Davis snapped. "We have a schedule to keep." Margaret watched as Dr. Chen raised the tranquilizer gun, aiming it at Thunder. The stallion was still 50 yards away, but closing the distance with each step, his ears. The federal holding facility was a sterile nightmare of concrete and fluorescent lights. Margaret sat in interview room B, her hands cuffed to a metal table, staring at her reflection in the one-way mirror. She'd been there for 6 hours without food, water, or her promised phone call. The door opened, and Agent Davis entered, carrying a thick file folder. He was followed by a woman Margaret didn't recognize 50's expensive suit, predatory smile. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from owning people rather than arresting them. "Mrs. Holloway," Davis said, settling into the chair across from her. "I'd like you to meet Victoria Blackwood. She's a federal prosecutor specializing in rural property crimes." Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "Hello, Margaret. We need to talk. I want my lawyer." "Your lawyer is unavailable," Blackwood said smoothly. "Sarah Morrison was arrested this morning on charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to commit fraud. Apparently, she's been helping clients hide assets from federal investigations." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her. Sarah had been more than her attorneys had been her friend, her confidant, the only person who knew the full truth about what had happened in Colorado. "You're lying, am I?" Blackwood slid a tablet across the table. The screen showed a news article. "Local attorney arrested in federal fraud investigation." Sarah's photo was prominently displayed, along with quotes from federal prosecutors. About her pattern of criminal behavior, Margaret's hands shook as she read. The charges were extensive and detailed, suggesting a long-running investigation, but the timing was too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated. "You did this," she said. "You destroyed her to isolate me." "I didn't do anything," Blackwood replied. "Sarah Morrison destroyed herself when she chose to help fugitives evade federal justice." Fugitives. Blackwood opened her file folder and spread several photographs across the table. They were surveillance photos, clearly taken with telephoto lenses, showing Margaret going about her daily life on the ranch. But there were other photos, 2 older ones, Granny A, showing a woman who looked like Margaret but with different hair, different clothes, a different life. "Melissa Hartwell," Blackwood said. "That's your real name, isn't it?" Melissa Hartwell of Denver, Colorado. Wanted in connection with the murder of federal contractor James Reeves. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She stared at the photos, her mind racing back 13 years to the worst day of her life, to the day everything fell apart in Colorado. "I was cleared of all charges," she said quietly. "You were released on a technicality," Blackwood corrected. "The murder weapon was ruled inadmissible due to an illegal search. But we both know you killed James Reeves. I defended myself. He was trying to rape me. He was trying to serve you with legal papers regarding your property. You lured him to your ranch and murdered him in cold blood." Margaret's vision blurred with rage. "That's a lie. James Reeves was a predator who'd been stalking me for months. He broke into my house, attacked me, and I fought back. The local police knew it was self-defense." "The local police were corrupt," Agent Davis said. "They covered up the murder to protect their friend." "Their friend?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "James Reeves was trying to steal my land for his development company, the same company that was bribing half the county commissioners." "It's had quite an imagination," Blackwood said. "But the facts are simple. You killed a federal contractor, fled the state, and assumed a false identity that makes you a fugitive from justice." Margaret studied the woman's face, looking for any crack in her composure. "What do you want?" "I want you to sign a confession," Blackwood said, sliding a document across the table. "Admit to the murder of James Reeves, and we'll consider a plea deal. In exchange for what? 25 to life instead of the death penalty." Margaret picked up the document and read the first few lines. It was a detailed confession, written in the first person, admitting to the premeditated murder of James Reeves. The language was careful, legalistic, designed to close every loophole. "And if I don't sign, then we prosecute you for murder, and we seize your Texas property under federal asset forfeiture laws. Your horses will be auctioned off to cover the costs of the investigation." The threat hit Margaret like a physical blow. They weren't just after her, they were after everything she'd built, everything she loved. "This is about the land," she said. "Someone wants my property, and they're using you to get it." "This is about justice," Blackwood replied. "Justice for James Reeves. Justice." Margaret's voice rose. James Reeves was a criminal. He was part of a conspiracy to steal private land through fraudulent liens and forged documents. "I have evidence. Evidence that was destroyed in the Colorado fire," Agent Davis interrupted. "How convenient." Margaret went cold. "What fire?" "The fire at the Colorado Springs Evidence Warehouse," Blackwood explained. "Terrible accident. All the evidence from your case was destroyed. So unfortunate." Margaret realized with growing horror that they knew everything. They'd been watching her planning this for years. The evidence fire wasn't an accident. It was part of the cover-up. "You're all in on it," she whispered. "The fake inspectors, the federal charges, the arrest of my lawyrettes, all connected." "You're paranoid," Blackwood said. "A common trait among fugitives." "Paranoid," Margaret laughed. "Lady, I've been running from people like you for 13 years. I know how this game works." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. James Reeves didn't work alone. He was part of a network of developers, lawyers, federal contractors, all working together to steal private property. They target rural landowners, especially women living alone. They use fraudulent liens, fake environmental violations, manufactured federal charges, whatever it takes to force a sale. "That's quite a conspiracy theory," Agent Davis said. "It's not a theory. It's a business model." Margaret's eyes were burning with fury. "And you're part of it?" Blackwood's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Sign the confession, Melissa. It's your only option. Like hell it is. Margaret grabbed the confession and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed in the small room like a gunshot. That was a mistake, Blackwood said. No, Margaret replied. The mistake was thinking I'd break as easily as I did 13 years ago. I'm not that scared woman anymore. Agent Davis stood up. Mrs. Holloway, you're being charged with murder in the first degree. You have the right to an attorney. I already told you. My attorney was arrested on trumped-up charges. Then you can get a public defender. Margaret laughed. Right? A public defender who's probably on your payroll too. The door opened, and Agent Martinez entered. He looked nervous, uncomfortable, like a man who'd just learned something that changed everything. Agent Davis, he said, we need to talk. We're in the middle of an interrogation. Now, Martinez insisted. It's about the video evidence. Davis and Blackwood exchanged glances. Something was wrong. Excuse us, Davis said to Margaret. We'll be right back. They left her alone in the interrogation room, but Margaret could hear raised voices through the door. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Someone was very angry about something. 20 minutes later, the door opened again. This time, it was Agent Martinez alone. He looked like a man who'd just seen his career go up in flames. Mrs. Holloway, he said, sitting across from her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I've been completely honest since this started. Have you ever met a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen? Margaret's heart skipped. She's the veterinarian who tranquilized my horse. Before today? Have you ever met her before today? No. Why? Martinez slid his tablet across the table. The screen showed a video-grainy security footage from what looked like a parking lot. Margaret watched herself talking to a woman in a white coat, but the woman's face was obscured by shadows. This is from the veterinary clinic in town, Martinez said. 3 weeks ago, the woman you're talking to is Dr. Sarah Chen. Margaret studied the video, her mind racing. She'd never met Dr. Chen before today, but someone who looked exactly like her had apparently been planning this for weeks. That's not me, she said. The facial recognition software says otherwise. Then your software is wrong. Martinez leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Holloway, I'm going to be straight with you. This case is falling apart. The video evidence from the horse incident has been compromised. The witness statements don't match. And now we have evidence that suggests you've been working with Dr. Chen to orchestrate this entire scenario. Working with her to do what? To create a situation where you could claim persecution, gain public sympathy, and sue the federal government for millions of dollars in damages. Margaret stared at him. You think I set this up? You think I orchestrated having my horse stolen? And my property seized? I think you're a lot smarter than you're pretending to be. Before Margaret could respond, the door burst open. Agent Davis stormed in, his face flushed with anger. Get her out of here, he said to Martinez. Now, what's happening? Margaret asked. Your little friend just destroyed everything, Davis snarled. Dr. Chen wasn't supposed to be recording her own activities. Turns out, she's been wearing a wire for the past month, and she just turned over 40 hours. Margaret arrived home to find her ranch transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered around the property like party streamers from hell, and federal investigators were photographing everything from her mailbox to her manure pile. But the sight that broke her heart was Thunder, standing alone in the near pasture, his magnificent head hanging low with exhaustion and confusion. Thunder, she called, running toward the fence. The stallion's head snapped up at the sound of her voice. For a moment, he stood frozen, as if afraid she might disappear again. Then he broke into a gallop, racing across the pasture with the desperate speed of a creature reunited with everything that mattered. Margaret climbed the fence and dropped into the pasture just as Thunder reached her. He pressed his massive head against her chest, his whole body trembling with relief. She wrapped her arms around his neck and felt tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry they took you. Thunder nickered softly, the sound vibrating through his chest. But Margaret could feel the change in him, the wariness that hadn't been there before, the new suspicion of strangers that would probably never fully fade. Mrs. Holloway. Margaret turned to see a young woman in a FBI jacket approaching the fence. She was Asian American, early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was very good at her job. I'm Agent Kim, the the woman said. "I'm leading the investigation into the conspiracy against you. Could we talk?" Margaret reluctantly left Thunder and climbed back over the fence. "What do you need to know?" "Everything," Agent Kim said, starting with Colorado. They walked to the house, where Margaret noticed that her front door was standing open. Through the doorway, she could see investigators going through her belongings with the methodical precision of archaeologists. "Do they have a warrant for this?" she asked. "We're collecting evidence of the conspiracy," Agent Kim explained. "Everything that's happened to you is part of a much larger pattern." They sat on Margaret's porch, and for the next hour, Margaret told her story. She started with Colorado, the death of James Reeves, the harassment campaign that had driven her from her home, the years of living under an assumed identity. She talked about settling in Texas, building a new life, finding peace with her horses. Agent Kim listened without interruption, taking notes on a tablet. When Margaret finished, the agent was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "finally, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. But I need you to understand the scope of what you've been caught up in. I'm listening. The conspiracy against you involves 12 states, 47 federal contractors, and an estimated $200 million in stolen property. James Reeves wasn't just a random criminal. He was part of the largest land theft operation in modern American history." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her. 200 million. Rural properties, mostly ranches, farms, family land that's been passed down for generations. The targets are always the same isolated properties owned by single women, elderly couples, or families in financial distress. How does it work? Agent Kim opened a file folder and spread several documents across the porch table. They were property deeds, legal notices, and court filings from across the country. "It's brilliant in its simplicity," Agent Kim explained. "First, they identify targets using tax records and property databases. Then they create a crisis-fake environmental violations, manufactured federal charges, fraudulent liens. The victims are forced to sell their property to cover legal costs, or the government seizes it through asset forfeiture." Margaret studied the documents. They all followed the same pattern: rural properties suddenly subject to federal investigation. Owners arrested on trumped-up charges, properties sold at auction for a fraction of their value. Who buys the properties? Shell companies, most of them, but they all trace back to the same source. Agent Kim pulled out a photograph of a man in his 60s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and expensive clothes. Robert Blackwood. Margaret's blood ran cold. Blackwood, as in Victoria Blackwood. The prosecutor who tried to force me to confess, his daughter, the family business, you might say. What kind of business is this? Land speculation. Robert Blackwood's company, Clearwater Development, has been buying rural properties for the past 15 years, but not through normal real estate transactions, through federal seizures and forced sales. They use corrupted federal contractors to create legal crises, then swoop in and buy the properties for pennies on the dollar. Margaret felt sick. "My property, what makes it special?" Agent Kim pulled out a geological survey map and spread it across the table. Margaret's ranch was highlighted in red, along with several surrounding properties. "Water rights," Agent Kim said. "Your property sits on top of one of the largest freshwater aquifers in Texas, with climate change and increasing drought. Water rights are becoming more valuable than oil." "How valuable?" "Conservative estimates put the water rights on your property alone at $50 million. Margaret stared at the map, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Her 40 acres weren't just a ranch, they were sitting on a fortune. "They've been planning this for years," she said. "Try decades. We found evidence that Clearwater Development has been tracking your property since the 1990s. They were waiting for the right opportunity to move on it, and I gave them that opportunity when I killed James Reeves." "When you defended yourself against James Reeves," Agent Kim corrected. "But yes, that gave them the opening they needed. They painted you as a dangerous fugitive, someone who couldn't be trusted with valuable resources." Margaret thought about the 13 years she'd spent running, hiding, building a new life under a false name. All of it had been orchestrated by people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their wealth. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build a case. Dr. Chen's recordings have given us enough evidence to arrest most of the low-level players, but we need more to get to Robert Blackwood himself." "What kind of more?" Agent Kim hesitated. "We need you to help us catch him." "How?" "He doesn't know that we've uncovered the conspiracy. As far as he knows, the plan is still on track. We think he'll make a move to acquire your property directly. You want me to be bait? I want you to be a partner in bringing down the people who've terrorized you for 13 years. Margaret looked across her property, where Thunder was grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. The stallion had been through hell today, but he was home. They were both home. But for how long? What would I have to do? Act normal. Go about your life. We'll have surveillance teams watching your property around the clock. When Blackwood makes his move, we'll be ready, and if something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong, Agent Kim said. We have teams positioned throughout the county. The moment there's any sign of trouble, we'll move in. Margaret wasn't convinced. She'd learned the hard way that federal promises weren't worth the paper they were printed on. But she also knew that running hadn't solved anything. 13 years of hiding had only delayed the inevitable confrontation. "All right," she said. "But I have conditions. Name them. My horses stay on the property. If this goes sideways, I'm not losing them again." "Agreed. And I want a weapon. If Blackwood comes for me, I'm not going down without a fight." Agent Kim nodded. "We'll make sure you're armed." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She looked at the screen and felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from an unknown number. "Ms. Hartwell, it's time we met face to face. Tomorrow, noon, at the old Clearwater Creek Bridge. Come alone, or your horses will pay the price." R. Blackwood Agent Kim read the message over Margaret's shoulder. "Son of a bitch. He's moving faster than we expected." "The Clearwater Creek Bridge," Margaret said. "That's only 5 miles from here." "Perfect. We can set up surveillance positions all around the area." Margaret looked at the message again, focusing on the threat about her horses. He knows exactly what buttons to push. That's what makes him dangerous, but it's also what's going to bring him down. As the sun began to set over the Texas hill country, Margaret sat on her porch and watched her horses graze in the golden light. Tomorrow, she would face the man who had destroyed her life, stolen her identity, and terrorized her for 13 years. But tonight, she was home. Thunder was safe. And for the first time in over a decade, Margaret Holloway Melissa Hartwell was ready to stop running. The war that had begun in Colorado was finally coming to an end. And this time, she was going to win. The Clearwater Creek Bridge stood like a monument to forgotten times, an old stone arch spanning a creek that had run dry 3 summers ago. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, her truck parked in the shade of ancient oak trees that had witnessed more than their share of secrets. The morning mist clung to the creek bed like smoke from a dying fire. She wasn't alone, though she appeared to be. Agent Kim's surveillance teams were positioned throughout the area, snipers in the hills, agents in camouflaged blinds, and a tactical response unit hidden in a barn half a mile away. Margaret wore a wire, and her every heartbeat was being monitored. By federal agents who had promised to keep her safe, but Margaret had learned not to trust promises. She checked her watch. 11:58 a.m. Her hand moved instinctively to the .45 caliber pistol holstered beneath her jacket, a weapon Agent Kim had personally provided. Margaret hoped she wouldn't need it, but 13 years of running had taught her to prepare for the worst. At exactly noon, a black Lincoln Navigator appeared on the far side of the bridge. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a hearse in a funeral procession. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as the vehicle stopped and a man stepped out. Robert Blackwood was everything she had expected, and worse. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair, perfectly styled, and clothes that cost more than most people made. In a month, but it was his eyes that chilled Hercule, calculating, completely devoid of human warmth. He walked onto the bridge with the confident stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed. Behind him came to bodyguards, professional muscle in expensive suits, who moved with the fluid grace of trained killers. "Melissa Hartwell," Blackwood said when he reached the center of the bridge. His voice was cultured, refined, with just a hint of Southern accent. "Or do you prefer Margaret Holloway?" "I prefer to be left alone," Margaret replied, staying 10 feet away from him, but apparently that's not an option. Blackwood smiled, but it was the expression of a shark scenting blood. "Alone, my dear woman, you've never been alone. I've been watching you for 13 years. I know everything about you, your habits, your weaknesses, your pathetic attachment to those animals. What do you want? What I've always wanted, your land, your water rights, your submission to the natural order of things. Natural order. Some people are born to own, others are born to serve. You've been fighting your nature for far too long. Margaret felt rage building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. The FBI was listening to every word, recording everything. This conversation would end Blackwood's empire. You killed people, she said. James Reeves? How many others? I never killed anyone, Blackwood replied smoothly. Other people made choices. Poor choices. James Reeves chose to assault you instead of simply delivering the papers. You chose to fight back instead of accepting the inevitable. He was going to rape me. He was going to give you documents transferring your property to my company. What happened after that was ... unfortunate. Margaret's hand moved toward her weapon, but she stopped herself. Not yet. The FBI needed more evidence. The federal contractors, she said. The fake inspectors? The corrupt agents? How many people are on your payroll? Blackwood's smile widened. Enough. America runs on capitalism, my dear. Everything is for sale judges, prosecutors, federal agents, even FBI surveillance teams. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Did you honestly believe the FBI would go to such lengths to help one insignificant ranch owner? Margaret's earpiece crackled with static, then went dead. Around the bridge, she could see movement in the Hills Agent Kim's surveillance teams. Were pulling back, abandoning their positions. You see, Blackwood continued, Agent Kim works for me. She has for 3 years. The entire investigation was designed to flush out the few honest agents in the Bureau and eliminate them. Dr. Chin's recordings were quite useful in that regard. Margaret realized with growing horror that she had been played from the beginning. The FBI investigation, the revelations about the conspiracy, the promise of protection, all of it had been orchestrated to bring her here, alone and vulnerable. The wire, she said, broadcasting to my people, not yours. Every word of this conversation is being recorded for my lawyers. When your body is found, it will appear that you came here to negotiate the sale of your property. Tragically, negotiations broke down and you became violent. One of the bodyguards stepped forward, producing a pistol from beneath his jacket. Self-defense, he said with a Russian accent. Very sad. Margaret's hand moved to her weapon, but she knew she was outgunned. 2 professional killers against 1 ranch woman with limited combat training. The math was simple and deadly. Any last words? Blackwood asked. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. Yeah, thunder. Blackwood frowned. What? I said thunder. The sound started as a rumble, like distant thunder rolling across the Texas hill country. But it grew louder, more focused, more purposeful. The bridge began to vibrate beneath their feet. What the hell? The Russian bodyguard began. 6 horses burst from the tree line like avenging angels. Thunder led the charge, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes burning with primal fury. Behind him came Whiskey Ranger, and the 3 younger horses, a cavalry charge that would have made the Texas Rangers proud. Margaret had spent years training her horses, building trust, establishing communication. What Blackwood didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that horses were herd animals. They protected their family, and Margaret was family. Jesus Christ! The second bodyguard shouted, raising his weapon. Thunder hit him like a freight train. 2,000 pounds of muscle and bone moving at 30 miles per hour. The man's gun went flying as he disappeared beneath thundering hooves. The Russian tried to run, but Whiskey cut him off, rearing up and striking with her front hooves. The man screamed as he went down, his expensive suit torn and bloodied. Blackwood stood frozen in terror as the horses surrounded him. Thunder approached. Slowly, his eyes locked on the man who had terrorized his human for 13 years. The stallion's nostrils flared, scenting fear and recognizing an enemy. Call them off, Blackwood screamed. Call them off. I don't control them, Margaret said, pulling out her pistol and aiming it at Blackwood's chest. They make their own choices. Thunder reared up on his hind legs, his massive hooves pawing the air inches from Blackwood's face. For a moment, Margaret thought the stallion might actually strike, but instead, he came down gently, pressing his muzzle against Blackwood's chest and breathing out a horse's way of claiming dominance. Blackwood's expensive suit was now stained with horse breath and his own terror. He stood perfectly still, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might provoke the magnificent beast towering over him. "Margaret." Agent Kim's voice echoed across the bridge. Real Agent Kim, not the imposter who had been feeding information to Blackwood. She was running toward them with a team of genuine FBI agents, their weapons drawn. "We got your message," Kim shouted. "All units converge on the bridge." Margaret smiled. The night before, she had sent a coded message to the real FBI field office, using information Dr. Chen had provided. The veterinarian had been genuine a real, undercover agent working to expose the conspiracy. The Agent Kim who had visited Margaret's ranch had been an imposter, part of Blackwood's elaborate deception. "You planned this," Blackwood gasped, still frozen beneath Thunder's intimidating presence. "I learned from the best," Margaret replied. 13 years of being hunted by predators teaches you a few things about setting traps. The real FBI agents swarmed the bridge, placing Blackwood and his surviving bodyguards under arrest. The Russian was unconscious but breathing, while his partner was being loaded into an ambulance with multiple broken bones. "Robert Blackwood," Agent Kim said, reading from a warrant. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, racketeering, and about 47 other federal charges that are going to put you away for the rest of your natural life." As they led Blackwood away in handcuffs, he looked back at Margaret one last time. "This won't end with me," he said. "There are others. Mabryfish, you'll never be safe." "Maybe not," Margaret replied, "but I'm not running anymore." Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, as if expressing his agreement with that sentiment. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in her kitchen, reading the newspaper coverage of Blackwood's arrest. The conspiracy had been even larger than anyone had imagined, a $2 billion operation, spanning 20 states and involving hundreds of corrupt officials. Blackwood was cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Her property was officially clear of all liens and legal complications. The water rights were hers, worth enough money to ensure she would never have to worry about finances again. Several major corporations had already made offers to purchase the water rights, but Margaret had turned them all down. The water belonged to the land belonged to the horses, and the horses belonged to her. Thunder appeared at the kitchen window, pressing his nose against the glass. Margaret laughed and went outside, where all 6 horses were waiting for their morning treats. "What do you think, boy?" she asked, scratching Thunder's neck. "Ready for